Imagine you are stuck at your home and your parents are gone and they've left you to babysit your little brother Jackie for the night. Now, Jackie is having a meltdown and you're just so desperate to shut him up that you decide to throw on a YouTube playlist of some Cocomelon videos in hopes that maybe he'll be quiet. 6 months later, Jackie is a crack-addicted, dopamine-dependent infant living in a tent on Skid Row. He's been kicked out of the family for his feeding ways and he is in and out of screen time rehab. This Cocomelon addiction has unfortunately led millions of babies all across America to a life of crime out on our streets. Donate to the GoFundMe linked in my bio to help save the crack-addicted screen time babies. Please and thank you. Obviously, I'm just joking. However, in recent years, there's been this multitude of controversies surrounding Cocomelon with what many parents are claiming to be predatory business practices. This can, of course, be seen with the highly saturated visuals, the contrasting colors, constant scene changes, all of these uses of psychology that make Cocomelon's episodes so addictive. Of course, all creators of both children and adult media want to maximize the audience attention rates. To be completely honest, I kind of do it too. Whenever I make clip changes, the reason why Cocomelon has become so controversial, so much more than any other YouTube channel or even any other social media platform, is because it will take these tactics and it will target babies and very, very young children. For example, did you know that the parent company of Cocomelon, Moonbug Entertainment, has been caught engaging in experiments with children to better help develop addictive scenes? A couple years ago, there was a whistleblower within Moonbug Entertainment alleging that the company was utilizing a study that's referred to as the Distractatron. This is a method that was first created and utilized by Sesame Street in the late 60s that involved taking hundreds of kids aged 0 to 3. The Distractatron was a series of tests where these children were shown episodes of Cocomelon on one screen and then they were shown random stock footage on a second screen. Moonbug Entertainment would use eye tracking technology, then they would keep constant tabs on where the children's eyes were looking. They would literally sit there and take note of the exact second any child's eyes stopped looking at the Cocomelon and instead looked at the other screen. They would know the exact point in the episode when the children's gaze was not focused entirely on the Cocomelon. Later, they would compile this into a series of things to change about the episode. This intense backlash has been spearheaded by two YouTubers, SunnyV2 and Savantix. Both of them have made viral videos explaining the issues with Cocomelon in depth. Their videos about Cocomelon did result in me going down an even larger rabbit hole of how modern kids media in general has just changed so much compared to the shows of the past, and it's really taken a turn for the worse. The reason why there's such a large and harmful difference between the newer kids shows as opposed to the ones made in past decades is because much of modern children's media is what we consider to be high stimulation, and it's much more addictive. And for the sake of this video, there are two very important moments in history that signify the change between the new and the old shows. The first point in time was the 2000s, which saw the industry-wide abandonment of 2D animation. That encompasses things like pencil drawn, stop motion, all of the above, and all of it was replaced slowly with 3D animation. The rise of 3D animation in the 2000s, it was kickstarted by the release of the original Toy Story movie, and it made it much easier for more interactive entertainment with precise changes of things like saturation, hue, constant jump cuts, and a host of other editing tricks used in high stimulation media. Even the small glowing rim that sits around the edges of so many characters in 3D animation today is a manifestation of this high stimulation culture. Now, about half of all animated kids media utilizes CGI. In addition to this, the use of 3D modeling software in new releases has risen from 45% to about 70% since 2018, and the market for three-dimensional software only seems to be growing with an estimated 14.2% compound annual growth rate by 2032. The second super consequential moment that separates the new versus the old kids media is the introduction of YouTube Kids along with the ability to monetize from it in the mid-2010s. This ushered forward a very algorithmic mentality into new kids shows that we see being made today. The reason why current adolescent content is so high stimulation and so addictive is because after the rise of 3D animation along with YouTube Kids, there's been this big trend of companies crafting entire series almost exclusively with the goal of keeping the baby's eyes glued to the screen and nothing else. They don't want to be educational. They damn sure don't want to help the kids. Retention for the sake of the view count is all these new age shows care about. The way they do this is by taking scientific literature on infant cognition, sometimes dating all the way back to the 1950s, and injecting the most scientifically proven ways to grab the baby's attention. Using the lowest common denominator of their minds in as many scenes as possible, they do this over and over again, intensifying it more and more each time. time until you get something like a Cocomelon. For example, there's a famous 1961 experiment by the American psychologist Robert Fance called the looking chamber. In this study, he documented all of the different visuals babies prefer to look at, discovering that babies tend to take particular interest in high contrast patterns. There have also been well-known studies done by other psychologists such as Russell Adams documenting high salience color preference in infants, which were further backed up by more literature in the following years. These high salience color preferences found in babies were later used in programming to implement super bright, super noticeable, super distinct colors that contrast highly with one another like the primary colors. For the sake of improving retention and watch time, many modern children's programs have moved away from the more muted, painterly colors that were seen in older animations. Instead, they want to lean into the super bright, easily recognizable colors. Many older children's shows had a more scenic, more blended style of animation, almost resulting in a watercolor effect. After 3D animation was adopted, the low stimulation color palettes were replaced with a lot of primary colors, very highly saturated super neon colors, and a simple color palette. Not too much blending, not too scenic, not like a watercolor effect. This is known in the design industry as the 3-color rule. Whenever you're examining newer TV shows, there's also extreme differences in the contrast between the foreground and the background within today's kids shows. For example, take a look at this scene from a recent episode of Paw Patrol and then compare it to this scene in The Frog and the Toad. As you can see, The Frog and the Toad has a much more flat appearance with not as much depth as Paw Patrol. According to Gibson's differentiation theory, a child's mind tends to filter out small or irrelevant details and they focus more on bigger shapes, but their ability to differentiate the foreground and the background is generally not well developed until they get older. Thus, not only are objects made in newer shows to fit these shapes, but there's also an extreme contrast between the foreground and the background, almost as a way of the show directing a child's eyes and holding their hand to have them figure out what they're supposed to be looking at, rather than them making the effort to figure it out themselves. Then we have the constant motion within the shot. Research has consistently shown that both infants and adults prefer moving stimuli over static stimuli. In recent years, kids media has increasingly incorporated what I like to call micro movements within the frames to maintain engagement. Micro movements are essentially what occurs when nothing of note is really happening on the screen. To avoid having absolute stillness, they want to be in constant motion. This can be something like the idle animations seen in video games, the slight swaying, blinking, head turns, side-to-side glances that occur even when no major action is taking place on the screen. Compare this to older kids shows like Davy and Goliath, and they somewhat tolerated more stillness between actions. Modern kids shows want to avoid stillness at all costs. Obviously, the more cuts in a show, the more engaging it's going to be. This study examined the effects of program pacing, and they showed 72 infants 2 different clips, each 5 minutes long. One had lots of scene cuts and the other had few scene cuts. Sure enough, the babies were much more invested on the one with more scene cuts. By the way, ASL stands for the average shot length. The ASL in kids media has been slowly decreasing by a few fractions of a second every single year for about 20 years now. The ASL for modern kids cartoons has decreased to only about 5 to 11 seconds.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1.
A couple examples of low stimulation older media that encompasses what TV was like before these changes that I mentioned are shows like Davy and Goliath, Tom and Jerry, Mr. Rogers, The Bernstein Bears, Barney, Max and Ruby, Little Bear, Winnie the Pooh, and Clifford. Some examples of high stimulation shows apart from Cocomelon would be both traditional and YouTube-based shows like Little Baby Bum, Paw Patrol, Baby Bus, Lulu Kids, PJ Masks. I would even argue that Lego Ninjago somewhat fits into this category. Another very good way of seeing the contrast between old and new kids media is to compare the OG Nickelodeon shows to the 2010s era Nickelodeon shows. You can also see this when comparing classic Disney with modern Disney movies. If you want to see all of the tactics I mentioned on display, compare a Disney or Pixar movie from the last 10 years like Frozen 2, Elio, or Elemental to the original Disney princess films, Peter Pan or Pinocchio. The classic Disney movies were made with almost zero experimentation regarding audience retention. Rather, they focused almost entirely on the elegance and the timelessness of the art. It wasn't until Sesame Street rose as a competitor with its frequent A/B testing that Disney began scrambling to catch up. After the development of the CAP system developed by Disney subsidiary Pixar, the classic era of Disney was essentially over. So I can show you all the changes in media that I want and all of the retention strategies that are used in the world, but the question still stands. Who gives a fuck? Who cares? Who really cares if modern kids media media is so much more immersive than it was in past years. I'll tell you why you ought to care, because not only does this promote screen addiction, there are scientifically proven long and short-term negative outcomes for prolonged exposure to this kind of media. By the way, all of these studies and sources are peer-reviewed studies within the last 30 years that I found in the National Library of Medicine, which I can link in the description if anyone wants to see for themselves what I'm talking about. Starting off with the short-term changes, you've got a reduction in executive function, which includes things like impulse control, cognitive memory, information processing, etc. There are also changes in attention spans. Infants and toddlers exposed to prolonged high stimulation media have reported higher levels of distractibility. There have even been reports of overly excitable and violent media causing an increase in heart rate. Higher paced media has been known to cause more shallow levels of information processing in children. When it comes to the longer term changes, kids have a decreased tolerance for boredom and stillness, tend to give up easily on boring or unenjoyable tasks like schoolwork. There's also been reported disruption in these kids' ability to fall asleep, further intensifying the delays in learning. There has also been some concerning correlations regarding these types of shows seen often throughout childhood. Kids with prolonged access to these types of shows are more likely to show symptoms of ADHD even when controlled for socioeconomic and genetic factors. They're more likely to have emotional regulation difficulties, experiencing frequent meltdowns or anger issues, low levels of academic readiness for their grade levels, reduced levels of imaginative play, and even in extreme cases, they have a higher likelihood of language development delays whenever they are exposed for a very long time to high stimulation media. In conclusion, modern kids' medias have changed significantly for the worse compared to shows of the past. The exploitation of young children has run rampant in these shows, and an overindulgence in them comes at serious expenses for the health and the well-being of kids. What I really want to encourage is a societal change, particularly when it comes to the platforms and the ability for a company to monetize so heavily from small children's views and retention. In truth, Cocomelon as it stands today wouldn't even exist if there wasn't such a heavy incentive from platforms such as YouTube Kids to make this much money. While advertising and selling data on kids' content is much more difficult than normal media, thanks to the 1998 Kids Online Privacy Protection Act, there's still a fuck ton of money to be made in high views and strong retention, which is ultimately what propels this exploitative editing. Really, more than the parents changing, what I really want to do is encourage people to put more pressure on the platforms like YouTube and YouTube Kids to decrease the financial incentive of companies that make media like this, more public scrutiny whenever companies engage in tests like the Distractitron. In the absolute best case scenario, I want to see more pressure on lawmakers to pass legislation similar to the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act to prevent overly incentivizing media made purely for retention as well.